Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing wonderful. First day of May, spring is springing and oocytes are developing. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about today. So just as a preview, a kind of preliminary announcement, this is our last official lecture together, so hold back your tears and emotions or anger or whatever other emotions you may be feeling. We're going to try to do our best to finish primarily talking about mostly female reproductive physiology. There will still be some male physiology that we'll discuss, but primarily female. A few other preliminary announcements. The lecture exam review poll that I sent in an announcement sometime last week, go in and complete that, fill that out if you haven't done so already. Do that by Saturday night at some point. And then the course evaluation as well. Right? So you should have got an email for the course evaluation. If the class as a whole gets 70% response rate, everybody gets 10 bonus points. Almost every semester, several students' grades come down to less than 10 points. So less than 10 points between an A and a B, B and a C, passing and failing. It happens somewhat regularly. So do the poll. It's anonymous. You can say something bad if you want. I don't care. I'll never know who said it unless you put your name, which sometimes people put their name, but you don't have to. Right? So what we're going to do today is continue looking at reproductive physiology, focusing on female. So these documents, these are posted in Blackboard, so hopefully you've had a chance to kind of look some of these over. This is the primary one that we're going to focus on. So this oogenesis, folliculogenesis, and ovarian cycle packet. Okay, so there's lots of stuff. So what we're going to be looking at, we're going to focus on the ovary. Remember, that's the female gonad, whereas the testes were the male gonads. And we're going to talk about the development of the oocytes, and then kind of simultaneously talk about the development of the follicle. Right. So recall, the follicle is the oocyte plus all of the cells that surround it. Okay. So you have an oocyte, you have the single haploid cell that we talked about on Tuesday, and then all the cells that surround that collective structure, that entire thing, that's the follicle, right? So this first page on this handout, oogenesis, that's talking about just the oocyte, and then the second one is folliculogenesis, that's talking about the development of the follicle, which includes the development of the oocyte. Okay? So they're two separate processes, but in reality they're occurring at the same time. So while the oocyte is progressing and maturing and developing, the follicle is also doing the same thing, right, at different stages. Okay. So this graphic here on the back side of the first page of this handout, it's a good way to look at what stage of oogenesis corresponds with what stage of folliculogenesis. So this is kind of a good picture to reference. Okay. So talking about our oocyte, haploid cell, right? Let me click here. Okay. So, our ovary, right? So, what we're going to look at are all of these small follicles with their oocyte. The oocyte is kind of that lighter colored structure in the middle, and then all the cells around it. So, we'll talk about these very early, primitive, undeveloped follicles, and then we'll progress all the way through to this large one called a mature follicle. Your text may say graphic follicle, if you've heard that term. I think I may use the term graphian in the notes, right? So, overview of oogenesis, right? So remember, oogenesis, this is gametogenesis, but for the oocyte, right? So, what was gametogenesis in the male? What was that called? That was spermatogenesis, right? Attendance question: where does spermatogenesis, or when does it begin? It begins at puberty, right? When does oogenesis begin? Before birth, right? So in utero, there are these primordial follicles developing, which contain something called a primary oocyte. A primary oocyte. So at birth, a female has all of the oocytes they will ever have. Okay. At birth, somewhere between 1 million and 2 million. Okay. The vast majority of those will never develop. They'll never mature, and they'll essentially die. They'll disintegrate in a process known as atresia. atresia, and we'll mention that term again here in a little bit, right? So these are the kind of quote-unquote stem cells, right? These oogonia, so going through mitosis. So think of the difference between mitosis and meiosis that we talked about on Tuesday. And then you start the process of meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2, right? So if you recall for male, for spermatogenesis, this process occurs just progressively, it occurs seamlessly, right? You go from the spermatogonia to the, go through meiosis 1, you produce primary spermatocytes, you continue, you get your mature sperm, or almost mature sperm at the end, right? This occurs at puberty, and there's no stoppage in the process. Okay? There's no major halts or stops or pauses during either meiosis 1 or 2 or in between meiosis 1 or 2, right? For spermatogenesis. For oogenesis, there are stops, there are pauses, okay? So initially, again, during puberty, during uterine development, during embryonic fetal development, a female is born with all the oocytes they'll ever have. Those are arrested, that's the term you'll typically see, meaning they're just kind of paused, if you will. They're arrested in prophase 1. Okay? So they start meiosis 1, they get to prophase 1, and they just stop. So think of the events that were occurring in prophase 1 that we talked about in our meiosis lecture, right? So it's arrested, it's stopped, it's paused in prophase 1, and it stays in prophase 1 until when? Until puberty, right? Until puberty, okay? So this process begins at birth, right? Or begins even before birth, but it doesn't resume, if you will, it doesn't finish until the onset of puberty, right? So it stays in that prophase 1, and it just stays there. It just camps out in that phase until you initiate puberty. You get the pulsatile releases of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which causes release of estrogen and progesterone that we'll talk about in a little bit. And it completes meiosis 1, starts meiosis 2, and then it stops again. Okay? In that case, it's stopping in what's called metaphase 2. So remember, metaphase, these cells line up along the metaphase plate, along the midline of the cell. At this point, these are beginning to separate, so they're haploid cells. Okay, these are haploid cells. And then ultimately, you'll end up with your mature secondary oocyte. But it doesn't finish meiosis 2 unless it's fertilized. Okay. So prophase 1, arrested until puberty. At puberty, it resumes, it starts again. It goes through metaphase 2 and stops. And then it continues meiosis 2, so it finishes out anaphase, telophase, cytokinesis, if it's fertilized. Right? If it's fertilized by a sperm. If it's not fertilized by a sperm, then it never finishes, it disintegrates, it dies. Right? So this here is that process, right, on the left. So this is oogenesis, development of the oocyte, gametogenesis in the female, right? So notice, arrested in prophase 1, arrested in metaphase 2. Okay? Again, this does not continue past metaphase 2 unless there's contribution from the male in the form of sperm. Right? So what this graphic also shows is on the right, you have the corresponding stages of folliculogenesis. So this picture is essentially the same picture as this one. Okay? It's slightly different, but it's basically the same. Okay? It shows oogenesis on one side, what's occurring with the oocyte, so the egg, the cell, and then on the other side, what's happening with the follicle, so the cells surrounding the oocyte. Okay? They're happening simultaneously. Right? So, big thing to know is that the oocyte is a primary oocyte, essentially all the way up until right before ovulation. Okay, right before ovulation. So we'll talk about ovulation. In the ovarian cycle, it occurs around day 14, and it is a primary oocyte, basically all the way up until right before ovulation. It finishes meiosis 1, becomes a secondary oocyte, and that secondary oocyte is what's released, is what's ovulated, right? A secondary oocyte. That secondary oocyte in metaphase 2, again, stays there until it's fertilized, or if it's fertilized by sperm, right? So, overview of oogenesis, right? Starts before birth, So again, all those oocytes at birth, 1 to 2 million. I think our book may say 1.5 million, something like that. Prophase 1 stops up to puberty, resumes. Metaphase 2 stops and continues if it is fertilized, right? So again, somewhere around 1.5 million at birth, right? Again, many of those undergo atresia, okay, atresia. And we'll talk about here in a little bit why atresia occurs. It's largely thought that it's because some of the follicles, in response to FSH and LH and estrogen, some of the follicles have fewer receptors, so they're not as responsive. So if they're not as responsive, they don't grow and they don't develop as much, so they wane, they disintegrate, they die off. But then there's a few follicles that have more receptors for FSH, LH, estrogen, so they're more responsive, so they bind FSH more, so they secrete more estrogen, so there's more FSH, so there's more estrogen, and this positive feedback loop kind of continues. Okay. So by the time you get to puberty, there's only a couple 100,000 left, right? So you started with a couple of million, 1 to 2 million, 1.5 million, and at puberty, there's only 400,000. Okay. Of these 400,000, the vast majority will also undergo atresia. They'll also die off. They'll also disintegrate. Okay. So you can do the math from the onset of menstruation at puberty, so somewhere between ages 10 and 14 in females average, up to the cessation of menstruation at menopause, average of once a month. It doesn't get to 400,000. Okay. You can just do quick math. So most of them end up dying off. Most of them undergo atresia. Right? So if we look at the process, we'll start at the very beginning, start at birth, right? Start in utero, start during embryonic fetal development. Somewhere around the 5th month, you begin to develop these primordial follicles, right? Primordial meaning like very beginning, early stage, right? And again, you've got somewhere around 1.5 million, 1 to 2 million. As we're doing these, as we're talking about the different stages of follicle development, again, in the handout, you can follow along. But think of and consider what is the type of oocyte, or what stage is the oocyte in during each of these phases, right? So is it a primary oocyte, or is it a secondary oocyte? Okay. Most of the time it's primary, right? Only a little bit of time is it secondary, right? So primordial, these are primary oocytes. Remember, these are the ones that are arrested, paused in prophase 1. Right? They have not completed even the first meiotic cycle, right? So you then develop into a primary follicle afterwards, okay? So again, on the handout, it goes from primordial, it then moves into primary follicle at puberty, right? So there are these pulsatile releases of FSH and LH that promote the development, and the levels of the hormones kind of rise and fall, so these pulsatile secretions, but it recruits some of those primordial follicles to begin developing, right? And they transition from a primordial state, primordial follicle, to a primary follicle, right? Main difference with these is you begin to get these granulosa cells that surround them. So they're all of these kind of simple cuboidal cells, this kind of epithelium around the oocyte. Okay? Those granulosa cells respond to FSH and LH by producing estrogen. Okay, by producing estrogen. Right? Now, as we'll see in a little bit, estrogen at different levels, at different concentrations, acts in different ways. At low levels, it acts through negative feedback early in this folliculogenesis process. Later on, higher levels of estrogen work in a positive feedback mechanism, right? And we'll see why that's important. Right? Why that's important. So they're producing estrogen, and then around it you have this kind of thin, clear glycoprotein barrier around the oocyte called the zona pellucida. Right, zona pellucida. It's just this kind of clear glycoprotein structure surrounding it, kind of keeps the oocyte separated from the granulosa cells. Right. The estrogen that's also produced from these follicles is also acting on the uterus as well, right? So it is in some way stimulating and preparing the uterus for potential implantation if there was fertilization, if there was sperm. So we move from primordial to primary to secondary follicles, right? Big thing here is you get more layers of granulosa cells. So again, on the handout, right below it, you move into a secondary. Secondary follicle begins to produce a new layer of tissue, more granulosa cells. You also get something called thecal cells. Okay, thecal, T-H-E-C-A-L, thecal cells. And really, these thecal cells, they organize themselves into two layers, the internal and the external layer. You don't have to worry about that. But if you see in the book or in a text something called the theca interna or theca externa, that's those two layers. Right? But just note there's thecal cells. Right? Main thing these thecal cells do is they produce androgens. So androgens are like hormones that promote the development of male sex characteristics. So think like testosterone. They secrete androgens that are then converted into estrogens by the granulosa cells. Right? So these thecal cells, in response to FSH and LH, make androgens. That androgen is converted into estrogens by the granulosa cells. So even more estrogen, right? More estrogen from the granulosa cells, more estrogen ultimately from the thecal cells, right? So as these develop, these granulosa cells, they begin to secrete a fluid. Okay? They begin producing and secreting a fluid. And this fluid in here is called antral fluid. Okay? The reason it's called antral fluid is because when you create this fluid, it forms this space inside the follicle, and that space is called the antrum. A-N-T-R-U-M, the antrum. So when you see the antrum, the fluid in it is called the antral fluid, and the follicle is called the antral follicle. Okay? So when you see the fluid beginning to form, you call that an antral follicle. Right? Some books will just make a designation between all the follicles that come before the antral follicle and all those that come after. So they'll call them pre-antral follicles. So meaning just all the follicles before the formation of the antral follicle. Right? And then you have the antral, and then ultimately you'll have your large mature one. Right? So this antrum, again, it's producing fluid. What also happens is as you produce this fluid, you begin to push that oocyte. Again, this is still a primary oocyte. You begin to push it kind of off to one side. So the pressure of the fluid is kind of forcing and shoving and moving that oocyte off to one side. Right? You also have this single layer of cells that forms around the oocyte, and that's called the corona radiata. Right? So it's just the remnants, it's kind of some of the leftover cells from all these granulosa cells out here. Right? So essentially, the antral follicle continues to produce fluid, the antrum gets larger, there's more fluid, there begins to be some breakdown of the outer wall of the follicle under the influence of luteinizing hormone and progesterone, as we'll talk about, and ultimately it forces the oocyte far off to one side, increasing the pressure, and then ultimately the follicle bursts, it ruptures, and it releases the oocyte. Right? Now at this point, at the mature follicle, so going from secondary to antral to mature, we have moved from being a primary oocyte to being a secondary oocyte. Right? So if you look at this here, right, we've moved from being a primary oocyte in the primary follicle, the secondary follicle, the antral follicle, and now we're a secondary oocyte in our mature follicle. Right? So when you hear the term mature follicle, think in it you have the secondary oocyte, right? Arrested in prophase, in metaphase 2, right? So it's not finished yet, right? The oocyte isn't done with oogenesis, gametogenesis, but it's moving that way, right? It's getting closer, right? So that's the secondary oocyte. You build up this big fluid in here. This is your mature follicle, again, sometimes called a Graafian follicle, right? Large, right? Now, again, rested in metaphase 2. How many of these usually form each month? Normally just one, right? Normally just one. So that typically results in only one zygote that could be formed, one offspring, right? Could more than one be released, though? Yeah, more than one could be released. If you have more than one mature follicle develop and you release, say, 2 secondary oocytes, and say both of those secondary oocytes are fertilized by sperm, what do you get? What kind of twins? Fraternal twins, right? So non-identical, right? Non-identical twins. That's what happens if you have 2 of these develop or more, right? Okay, so this mature follicle, it swells because of the increase in fluid. Luteinizing hormone is ultimately what's going to cause this to occur, as we'll see in a little bit, and you release the secondary oocyte. Okay. You keep all of this other stuff, besides the oocyte, you keep it around, and it becomes something called the corpus hemorrhagium, which then develops into the corpus luteum. Okay, corpus luteum, right? Big thing with corpus luteum is what it produces. It produces progesterone, right? Progesterone. So when you hear the term corpus luteum, just automatically think progesterone, right? Automatically think progesterone. What does that progesterone do? It's getting the what specifically is it getting ready? It's getting the lining of the uterus ready, right? Why? Because maybe there's sperm, maybe there's fertilization, maybe there's implantation, right? So the body doesn't know, right? The uterus is not aware of whether or not there's sperm present. So it prepares, it develops, it gets ready for the implantation, assuming that there was sperm, assuming that there was fertilization, right? So it's going to get ready. Right? So it will thicken, the endometrial lining will enlarge, and they'll get ready for potential implantation. Right? So this corpus luteum, producing progesterone, it sticks around for a number of days, continuing to produce progesterone. Those high levels of progesterone prevent other follicles from continuing to develop. Right? So it prevents all this other process that we just talked about here, to primary, to secondary, to antral, to mature. It prevents that from happening. Prevents a mature follicle from forming, right? Why is that important? So you have this progesterone from the corpus luteum, right? Making lots of progesterone, stimulating up the uterine lining for potential pregnancy. Why is that important that it's preventing the development of other follicles? Do what? Not necessarily. I mean, it is preventing the shedding of the uterus for now because it's building it up. But think about its role with the follicles, right? So, again, think from the perspective of the uterus, right? If the uterus is thickening, it's getting ready, it's maybe assuming that there's going to be fertilization and implantation, thus pregnancy. So during pregnancy, do you continue to develop follicles, to mature follicles? No, right? So there's no ovulation, there's no release of follicles during pregnancy because the high levels of progesterone prevent those follicles from ultimately developing all the way to mature follicles releasing an oocyte, right? So during pregnancy, you're not releasing the follicles because there's already a pregnancy, right? There's already a follicle that's been, an oocyte that's been fertilized, implantation, and so on, right? So that's the main role there, right? So this corpus luteum, it hangs around for a few days. Progesterone, if there's no fertilization and implantation, it breaks down. It turns into the corpus albicans, and the corpus albicans is non-functional. It does not produce progesterone. It doesn't really produce anything. Progesterone levels decline, uterine lining is shed, and you can begin to produce new follicles. So you now recruit, again, more primary follicles to go to secondary follicles, more secondary to go to antral, more antral to go to mature, and then the process continues again, right? So you get ovulation again. So that whole process is folliculogenesis, right? Occurring alongside and essentially at the same time as oogenesis, right? So again, take that picture that's in the, well, I added one of those pictures. If you need to take a picture of it, you can later. But this picture here that's in this packet, again, compare what stage of oogenesis aligns with what stage of folliculogenesis, right? When I have my primary oocyte in prophase 1, where am I in folliculogenesis? When I have my mature follicle, where am I in oogenesis? Right? Ask yourself those types of questions. Right? Okay, so folliculogenesis. So for folliculogenesis, you can describe and you can put these major events into different stages or different phases. So we talked about the primary follicle, primordial, primary, secondary, and so on. Again, this is how I mentioned it earlier. Some texts will describe it as being preantral and then antral. Right? Another thing to consider is during this whole process, in the uterus, if you could peer into the ovary, if you could look into the ovary, you would see follicles at different stages. So they're not all at the primary, they're not all at secondary, they're not all at antral, they're not all at mature. They're at varying phases. But it's only the mature follicles around that day 14 when luteinizing hormone surges and causes ovulation. It's just that mature follicle, again, usually one that is released, right? So you can divide this whole process into these phases here: follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. Okay. And then here in a little bit, we'll talk about some of the hormones that are happening, right? So if we assume a 28-day cycle, right, for the ovarian cycle, meaning what's happening with the oocyte in the ovary, what's happening with the follicle in the ovary. That's this ovarian cycle, right? So the first 13 days, you are developing the follicle. Right? The follicle is going from that primary to the secondary to the antral to the mature or the rapid, right? So again, several follicles begin developing, right? Many of them are recruited by the pulsatile releases of FSH and LH. Several of them begin to increase in size. They begin to mature into primary follicles, which then mature into secondary follicles, but not all of them, right? So many will be recruited, but say only one or two will be kept, right? Only a few meet the necessary criteria to continue forward in this process, right? So again, the reason for that being likely that some of those primary, secondary follicles don't have a sufficient number of receptors for the FSH, for the LH, estrogen. And so if they don't have enough receptors, they don't respond to the hormones, they don't mature, right? They essentially break down that atresia process, right? Usually one, though, is the most responsive. It has meaning it has the most number of receptors. So it's the most sensitive to those hormones. So it continues, it progresses through this developmental process, right? So again, as we mentioned earlier, it matures, it gets larger, it forces the oocyte off to one side, right? So during this process, again, folliculogenesis and oogenesis are separate, but they're occurring more or less they're overlapping in terms of when they occur, right? So during this phase, again, we have a primary oocyte, and so think of the process of oogenesis. Okay? So I think we mentioned this a little on Tuesday, but during oogenesis, so again, gametogenesis for the oocyte, the division of the cell is not equal, right? So you get one kind of large cell that gets half the chromosomes, and then you get this other kind of smaller cell that also gets some of the chromosomes, but not organelles and cytoplasm and things like that, right? That small one, that's called a polar body. The polar body is non-functional, it breaks down, it's not useful. It does not contribute anything. Okay? It still gets half the genetic material, but it doesn't mature, right? That polar body may or may not go through the second meiosis. Okay? It may stick around, produce another one, it may not. Okay? The other cell that's formed during the oogenesis, during that meiosis 1, with half the genetic material, it has more of the cytoplasm, it has the organelles. It goes through meiosis 2. Again, it stops in metaphase 2. But it will also produce a polar body, right, if it finishes, right, if it completes the process. That polar body is also non-functional. Right? So this is why we mentioned in spermatogenesis, for the whole process, you make 4 cells. Remember, they are genetically different from each other and to their parent cell. In oogenesis, you ultimately make only 1 cell, right? Because all the others are the polar bodies, right? So it's slightly different, right? So again, one receives the bulk of the cytoplasm, it gets half the genetic material, gets most of the organelles, and so on, right? Again, it'll continue if it's fertilized. So that follicular phase, follicular describing what's happening to the follicle, right? It's developing from primordial up to mature, right? That's days 1 through 13, if you take a 28-day cycle, right? Around day 14, you get ovulation, right? You get ovulation. When you think ovulation, think luteinizing hormone. Okay? Just ovulation, you should just reflexively say luteinizing hormone, right? It's just, that's what causes it, right? So you get this pulsatile release of luteinizing hormone in response to the positive feedback loop that's now being initiated from the estrogen. Right? So FSH and LH are released from where? Where do FSH and LH come from? Anterior pituitary, right? So in the brain. They're released, they travel in the blood, they're hormones, they bind to their receptors on these cells, this mature follicle. And that mature follicle produces estrogen, right? At higher levels, whenever you really only have one mature follicle, that increase in estrogen is a positive feedback loop to release more FSH and LH. So more FSH and LH are released, which causes more estrogen to be produced and secreted, which causes more FSH and LH, which causes more estrogen. And this process continues in a classic positive feedback style, right? And the LH ends up increasing above and beyond the levels of FSH. So this LH surge, luteinizing hormone surge, this increase in its concentration in the blood, is what triggers ovulation, right? The LH also stimulates progesterone to be released from some of those granulosa cells. The progesterone breaks down the wall of the follicle, and it's released, right? So you ovulate around day 14, right? You release that oocyte. What type of oocyte is it? Secondary, right? So what oocyte is released? It's a secondary oocyte. What oocyte is ovulated? Secondary. So follicular phase, development of the follicle, days 1 through 13. Ovulation, somewhere around day 14. And then you have the luteal phase. So this is the formation of the corpus luteum, and this is the formation then ultimately of the corpus albicans, right? So corpus luteum producing progesterone, helping to maintain the uterine lining. Again, maybe there's sperm, maybe there's fertilization, maybe there's implantation, maybe you get a zygote, maybe you have pregnancy, right? So again, this is after day 14, so days 15 through 28. Right? What we'll look at in a little bit, I'll show you a graph, a picture showing you the stages of these, so follicular, ovulation, luteal phase, and where does that match up with the menstrual cycle, right? So we'll talk about the menstruation, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. Right? We'll talk about where do these align, where do they fall with each other. So all of these here are luteal phase, right? So luteal phase continues until you form the corpus albicans. Corpus albicans, again, it does not produce progesterone. Progesterone levels drop. The blood vessels in the uterine lining constrict, and that inner lining called the stratum functionalis, the functional layer of the endometrium, is essentially deprived of nutrients, deprived of blood and oxygen. It dies, and it is shed during menstruation. Right? So menstruation, as we'll see, that is not the end of a cycle. That marks the beginning of the next one. Right? So the first 4 or 5 days or so of the new menstrual cycle, that's menstruation, right? And then you have the proliferative phase, and then you have what's called the secretory phase, right? Okay, so this here, different picture, but it's showing you basically the same thing as one of those previous ones, right? So on the left, you see the development of the oocyte, so oogenesis. On the right, you see the development of the follicle, right? On the far right, this is a really good picture. You can see histological images of the follicles along with their oocyte at each of those different developmental stages, right? You don't really need to worry about that as much, but something interesting you can see is you can begin to see the development of that antrum, right? Hopefully you can begin to see the fluid forming, that fluid-filled cavity beginning to form here in this antral follicle, right? So this whole thing here, that's the oocyte. That small thing right there, that's the oocyte there, right? And then this space around it here and here, that's the antrum, right? And you can see that it's pushing that oocyte off to one side until ultimately it will be released, right? So this shows you oogenesis and folliculogenesis. Here you can see basically the same thing. So here is folliculogenesis. Here are the hormone levels, and then this down here, this is the sometimes called the uterine cycle. So what's happening in the uterus with menstruation, the proliferative phase, and then something called the secretory phase as well, right? So you can see here, notice here estrogen begins to increase in concentration, and this is about the time whenever we start forming that mature follicle, right? So that's that positive feedback loop I was explaining earlier that causes all of those other follicles to essentially die off, disintegrate, undergo atresia, right? And then notice here around day 14, if you look at this top graph, what hormone level do you see spike really high? You see LH, right? So here in green, around day 14, we're really starting a little bit before, but peaking around day 14 is LH, right? Stimulating ovulation, right? Stimulating the release of that oocyte. And then notice here, after ovulation, what hormone level do you see increased after ovulation? Progesterone, right? Where's that progesterone coming from? The what? Corpus luteum. Right? Corpus luteum. So maintaining or getting ready the inside of the uterus. So you can relate that. So ovulation, increase in progesterone. Notice what's happening with the inside of the uterus, right? It's in this proliferative and secretory phase, meaning it is enriching. There's glycogen stores being packed into the uterus. It's very rich and vascular, so lots of blood supply. It's getting ready for implantation, right? Or it's preparing for the possibility of implantation, right? And then when it doesn't happen, corpus luteum breaks down into a corpus albicans. Notice here progesterone levels drop, and this corresponds to the beginning of this next uterine cycle. So menstruation, and then you just start the process over, right? So this is all kind of idealized, a normal, normal 28-day cycle. So that's what we'll kind of base it on, right? So this here is showing the role of hormones, and we'll talk about hormones more in just a second. The role of hormones in the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase, right? So keep this in mind. Do you have this slide in your PowerPoint, or did I add this afterwards? You have this in yours? Okay, good. So this is a good kind of summary slide for some of these hormones that we're going to talk about coming up, right? So what is the role, the specific role of some of those hormones in the development of sperm, in the development of the oocyte and the follicle, and preparing the uterus, and all those fun things. Okay, any questions on oogenesis or folliculogenesis? No? Okay. So again, this is a decent resource for you to use and look at. And then at the end, on the last kind of page or two, I essentially describe what we're about to talk about. What's the role of the hormones, right? We've mentioned some of the hormones a little bit, but we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it again, right? So this here, this is kind of the basic sequence of events, sequence of hormones, where are they released from, where are they going, what do they result in both male and female. So oogenesis and folliculogenesis, right? So same basic hormones. We looked at this slide, I think, a little bit on Tuesday. So gonadotropin-releasing hormone, right? How do you know it's from the hypothalamus? Releasing hormone, right? FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, acting on the gonads to release sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, things like that, stimulating gametogenesis, right? So this is kind of a common pathway, if you will, between males and females, right? So if we look at male specifically, there's a lot of things going on here, okay? So there's this slide, which is good. There's another slide right after this that I think is a little bit better, okay? But I'll at least show you this one, right? So always start in the hypothalamus, okay? That's where that releasing hormone, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's where it's coming from. So it is stimulated to be released. Again, spermatogenesis, this is occurring when? This starts around puberty, right? So around the onset of puberty, you get these pulsatile releases of gonadotropin releasing hormone acting on anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, right? These are called gonadotropins. Okay? That's just a class of hormone because they stimulate the gonads, right? Their target are the gonads, right? So in this case, the testes, right? So FSH, LH, LH in males is also called ICSH, interstitial cell stimulating hormone. It stimulates a cell called interstitial cell. So it's called interstitial cell stimulating hormone. Right? It's very descriptive, right? But you could also call it LH. It doesn't matter. Right? In females, it's just LH. So FSH, its big thing, acting on these Sertoli cells, and these Sertoli cells secrete something called androgen binding protein, ABP, androgen binding protein. The interstitial cells, sometimes called Leydig cells, secrete testosterone, right? They secrete testosterone. The testosterone is necessary to stimulate the development of sperm. So you have to keep the testosterone levels high in these seminiferous tubules, right? Where do you find these seminiferous tubules? Where are they? They're in the testes, right? So you have to keep the testosterone levels high in the testes, in the seminiferous tubules, to stimulate the development of sperm, so to promote spermatogenesis. So the release of LH causing the production of testosterone, and the release of FSH causing the release of that androgen-binding protein. The androgen-binding protein binds the androgen. The androgen is testosterone. So the name of the hormone tells you what it does. It binds, it's a protein that binds androgen. The androgen is testosterone. Keeps the concentration level high, keeps it high in the testes to stimulate spermatogenesis, right? This whole process, it acts through a simple negative feedback loop, right? So when you have more testosterone, which is downstream going to result in more sperm production, more spermatogenesis, that acts in a negative feedback loop for GnRH and LH. So less stimulation of LH, less testosterone, less sperm production. And then sperm production levels drop, testosterone levels are low, and also a negative feedback loop, but just the exact opposite. So more GnRH, more LH, more testosterone, more sperm production, and then a negative feedback loop the other way, right? So it's just a classic negative feedback. This here is showing the same thing, but I like this better because it actually shows you the organs, the structures, right? So here's your hypothalamus, here's your pituitary, here are your seminiferous tubules in your testes, right? So it's the exact same thing as this, just different, right? It shows you the actual pictures, same hormones, same basic negative feedback loops, right? Everything in green is stimulatory. It's promoting that process, promoting that hormone release. Everything in red is negative feedback, right? Or I'm sorry, it's negative feedback. It's inhibitory, right? It's acting on that gland, that region, to prevent the release of that particular hormone. Okay. So again, you can kind of work through these steps here, right? But just think testosterone binds to the androgen binding protein, keeps the concentration levels high, sperm production, right? Two cells, the Leydig cells also called interstitial, or the nurse cells, which are also called sustentacular cells, which are also called Sertoli cells. So there's lots of different names for the same thing, so it's not confusing at all. Okay, so that's male. Okay, that's the male, the hormones, the role of the hormones in male reproductive physiology. Okay, so relatively straightforward. Would you agree? Relatively straightforward. Okay. So, not the case for females. Okay, females slightly more involved. Okay, so some of these things we've already talked about. Okay, that we're going to get to in a second. So it's just kind of a review. We're just incorporating, adding, including the specific roles of the hormones. Right. So exactly what does FSH do? What does LH do? How does progesterone work? Things like that. Right. So again, keep in mind development of the follicle, or development of the oocyte, development of the follicle, and then how is that corresponding, how is that matching up with what's happening in the uterus. Okay, and we'll look at that in just a little bit. Right. So first is that early follicular phase. Okay, so all of this is the follicular phase. So remember you had follicular, ovulation, luteal. So this is follicular, the very beginning. Okay, so this is when the early primordial follicles are beginning to develop into primary follicles. So again, somewhere starting around puberty, estrogen levels that are being, estrogen that's being produced in response to the FSH and LH are just beginning to rise. Okay, they're just beginning to rise. So you can look here, estrogen here, it's slightly ticking up, slightly, but not much. Okay, that's because you've just started the process of recruiting these primordial follicles. They're just starting to respond to FSH. They're just starting to produce estrogen. Right? So you've got a little bit of estrogen, but not much. Okay? At lower concentrations, so way down here instead of way up here, low estrogen concentrations are negative. They act through a negative feedback. Right? So in other words, estrogen levels begin to rise, stimulates the hypothalamus and the pituitary to stop releasing FSH and LH. So there's less estrogen. So most of those follicles do not continue. Most of them do not continue to mature, right? However, usually a couple will continue. They're more responsive. They're more sensitive to the hormones because it's thought they have more receptors. Right? So if they have more receptors, they're more sensitive. They continue to progress, right? They continue to develop, right? So usually one follicle remains, again, because of that low FSH, because of the negative feedback from the estrogen. Okay. So again, negative feedback here, notice the estrogen levels were going up. So we were looking here, estrogen levels begin to increase, and then here you see a slight drop, right? That's that initial negative feedback. It drops, FSH goes down, negative feedback, estrogen levels begin to increase again. So again, just think of your normal endocrine negative feedback loops, right? That's all this is. That's all this is, right? So estrogen levels begin to increase again because now we've gone down, negative feedback loop is initiated, estrogen levels begin to rise, right? So estrogen levels begin to rise, and as you get increased amounts of estrogen acting on the hypothalamus, acting on the pituitary, you switch from that negative feedback to a positive feedback, right? So notice here at the very beginning, we had an initial increase and then a decrease. But after that initial decrease, it just goes up, right? There's no more drop in levels because now it's straight positive feedback. Estrogen's released, FSH and LH are released, stimulate the follicle to release more estrogen, which causes more FSH and LH to be released, which causes the production of more estrogen, which causes more FSH and LH, and this positive feedback perpetuates. It continues, it continues, it continues, until the LH levels, the luteinizing hormone levels, outweigh, they increase above and beyond that of FSH, right? That LH, again, when you think of luteinizing hormone, what should you think of? What happens? Ovulation, right? Ovulation. So that's exactly what you get around that day 14, right? So notice estrogen levels are beginning to rise, luteinizing hormone levels are also beginning to peak, and at that peak, you get ovulation, right? right after ovulation, estrogen levels drop because they're no longer responding to the FSH, and instead you've got progesterone. So notice right here, as estrogen levels begin to drop, progesterone levels begin to rise, right? So that's what's happening after ovulation, right? So ovulation somewhere around day 14, and then you move into that luteal phase, right? Progesterone level preparing the endometrium, getting ready for fertilization, getting ready for implantation, getting ready for pregnancy. And then after a number of days, if there is no implantation, corpus luteum disintegrates, turns into the corpus albicans, and notice progesterone levels begin to decline, right? If you look where the progesterone levels begin to drop, if you look up at the top graph, you can also begin to see FSH and LH kind of starting to make an uptick again, just slightly, right? So right here, as progesterone levels are nearing the bottom, if you go up here, you can kind of see FSH and LH, they're starting to move up, right? The next cycle, the next recruitment cycle, the next process is beginning again, right? So now FSH and LH are going to increase again. They're going to recruit some more follicles. They're going to release a little bit of estrogen. Most of the follicles are going to undergo atresia. One is going to hang around, and this process continues. Okay. All right. So while that's happening, again, there's also things going on in the uterus as well, right? That's all of these things that are happening with the oocyte, everything that's happening with the follicle. The uterus has to prepare for the production of that secondary oocyte, for the contribution of sperm, for potential fertilization, implantation, and pregnancy, right? So this menstruation, this very beginning part of this uterine cycle, this is characterized by the loss of the endometrium, right? That endometrial lining is shed, it is lost in response to what? What causes this loss of the uterine lining? What do you think? A decrease in progesterone, right? Why is there a decrease in progesterone? Okay, why did the corpus luteum turn into the corpus albicans? There's no fertilization. Right? There's no fertilization, there's no implantation, there's no pregnancy. So why do you need the endometrium lining thick? Answer, you don't. Right? So it sheds, right? Those vessels constrict, it sloughs off, and it's lost. So that's this initial menstrual phase of the uterine cycle. So that, again, that marks the beginning of this cycle, of this phase, right, of this uterine cycle, right? Around here, day 6, day 7, you begin this proliferative phase. This corresponds to the end of the follicular phase and then sometime around ovulation. So basically, while the follicle is developing, it's going from the primordial to the primary to the secondary to the antral to the mature or Graafian. The uterus is getting ready, right? The uterus is proliferating. It's thickening, the cells are being replaced, there's lots of glycogen that's being added to the uterus, the blood vessels are increasing, it's getting ready for ovulation. It continues this proliferation in a phase called the secretory phase, continuing to thicken, secreting mucus and whatnot, getting ready for potential implantation, right? If there's no fertilization, if there's no implantation, it drops, and so this drop that you see here, that corresponds to the beginning of the next uterine cycle, right? It corresponds to that menstruation, right? So menstrual phase, usually the first 4, 5, 6 days, right? There's some variation. The loss of that functional layer, so there's 2 layers to the endometrium called the stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis, right? Stratum, think of like when you talked about skin, like stratum corneum, right? Stratum just means layer, right? So stratum functionalis, that just means the functional layer, right? That's the layer closest to the lumen of the uterus, right? Underneath it, there is a stratum basalis. So the basal layer, the layer underneath, that whenever that functionalis layer sheds and sloughs off, the basalis proliferates and it replaces the functionalis. Right? So there's always that basalis producing new functionalis, and then the functionalis is lost. and then new basalis produces new functionalis. It's sloughed off during menstruation. Right. So menstrual phase, first 5, proliferative phase up through day 14, and then the remainder are the secretory phase. Right. So again, getting ready for the ultimate, potentially ultimate fertilization, implantation, and pregnancy. Right. So lots of glands, lots of mucus, lots of progesterone, things like that. Right. So if you don't get fertilization, corpus luteum degenerates, loss of progesterone, menstruation, right? And then you start. So looking at pictures like this are helpful. Okay. And I think I have one. Yeah, there's one kind of like this on the very last page of that handout. So it shows at the top the role of the pituitary hormones, the role of the folliculogenesis, at the same time oogenesis, and then what's happening inside the uterus, right? So the uterine cycle, right? So again, folliculogenesis, primordial to primary to secondary to antral to mature. What's happening with the pituitary hormones, follicle, estrogen, progesterone, and then uterine cycle, right? So really, the way I would approach this is I would kind of take each of these separately at first. So make sure you understand oogenesis. What is basic oogenesis? What's the process? Add to that folliculogenesis. So as the oocyte's developing, overlapping with that, the follicle is forming and developing and maturing. And then both of those, oogenesis and folliculogenesis, while those are occurring, where does it match up with what's happening in the uterus, right? And then just add your hormones, right? Pituitary hormones, FSH and LH, also gonadotropin releasing hormone from hypothalamus, and then estrogen and progesterone from the ovary, from the follicle, from corpus luteum, things like that. Right? So kind of take them separately initially, but don't keep them siloed. Right? Don't keep them separate. Combine them, put them together for a more holistic picture, right? As you're studying this. Right? Okay. Any questions on any of that? No? So I know it's a lot. It's a little more involved than the male physiology. So again, take it one step. Use your notes, right? Use your handout, and that should be helpful. Okay, so what we're going to do here for the next 15 minutes or so that we have left is talk a little bit about common origin. So meaning the development of some of these reproductive structures that we've looked at, that we've mentioned, that we talked about in lab. Where do they come from? How are they shared? How are they similar between males and females, right? So this graphic we looked at previously, right, I think on Tuesday. So again, way back here, this genital ridge, right, back here, this is what's ultimately going to become the gonads. And then you have this duct system, right? So you've got these duct system in here called the Müllerian duct and the Wolffian duct. You don't really need to know a whole lot about those other than the fact that one of them is going to turn into male reproductive structures and one is going to turn into female reproductive structures, right? So the Wolffian duct, this is turning into the male, right? So think epididymis, ductus deferens, seminal vesicle, ejaculatory duct, things like that. Okay. The Müllerian duct, and you may see other names for these called the mesonephric duct and the paramesonephric duct. If you see that, that's what those are referring to. But this is going to turn into parts of the female reproductive tract. Think like fallopian tubes, right? So again, part of the tube system, fallopian tubes, uterus, and then the upper aspect of the vaginal canal, right? So one is going to turn into male, one is going to turn into female. In what will ultimately become genetic male, the female portions, the Müllerian portions, are largely going to break down and disintegrate, and then vice versa in the female. The Wolffian ducts are going to break down. Right? So we start off, it's this right here. Okay. So this middle graphic here is showing something called the indifferent stage. Okay? What this indifferent stage means is that in this developing embryo, this is occurring during the first 8 weeks of development. Okay? So really early on, you look like a little freaky, like salamander-looking lizard thing. You don't look like you don't look like you do now, right? As you progress into fetal development, so after 8 weeks, you begin to resemble more of kind of our basic adult structure. So this indifferent stage, this is saying that there's an early point in development in which there is no physical difference between what will ultimately become genetic male and genetic female, right? So it's indifferent. You have both sets of structures. You have both of those Wolffian ducts and the Müllerian ducts. The Müllerian ultimately turning into female reproductive structures, Wolffian turning into male reproductive structures. You have both. Okay? You have both, right? Under the presence, or rather in the presence, of this thing called the SRY. So SRY stands for the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. That's SRY, sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. Right? So it's on the Y chromosome. Right? So if you get a Y chromosome, right? So remember, the female contributes the X, because that's the only thing present, the only sex chromosome present, X. The male will contribute either an X or a Y. So if a Y is contributed and you get an X and you get a Y, that's genetic male, right? Because of the presence of the Y chromosome, right? So in that case, you have the Y chromosome, and there's a portion, there's a segment, there's a gene on the Y chromosome called the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome, and it produces something called TDF, or testis determining factor, right? TDF, testis determining factor. Essentially, it is helping to keep around this Wolffian duct, keep it around such that it develops into the male reproductive structures. Epididymis, ductus deferens, seminal vesicle, ejaculatory duct, right? So if you have the Y chromosome, and you have this SRY region of the Y chromosome that produces the testis determining factor protein, then you keep around the Wolffian duct. If you don't have the Y chromosome, so you only have X, so genetic female, you don't have it, you don't have the SRY, you don't have the testis determining factor. So instead of keeping around the Wolffian ducts, those degenerate, and instead you keep around the Müllerian ducts, which turn into the female reproductive structures. So think, again, fallopian tubes, parts of the uterus, upper part of the vaginal canal, things like that, right? There's also then the changes in the primordial gonads. So in the presence of Y chromosome, the SRY gene, testis determining factor, that turns into the testes in male, and without it, it turns into the ovaries in female, right? But you start off with no difference, right? It's sometimes called the ambiguous stage. You can't tell, right? So this is why early stages of pregnancy, you have to wait a certain point to be able to find out the genetic sex of the fetus, right? It doesn't happen, you can't tell in the first week, 2. Often you don't even know that you're pregnant in those first couple of weeks. But even if you did, you wouldn't be able to tell because there'd be no physical difference. It would just look like this little embryo, right? You wouldn't be able to tell. Okay, so these are what are happening to the tubes, and then phenotypically, so meaning physically, you begin to move and change structures into either male reproductive parts or female reproductive parts, depending on whether or not these tubes, these Wolffian tubes, are maintained, or whether the Müllerian tubes are maintained, right? So you can look at this graphic here. I don't like this one as much. There's kind of a lot going on. This one's a little bit better. Okay. So what you see here in the middle, if you look in the middle first, these are shared structures in this indifferent stage in the developing embryo. Okay? So there's something called the genital tubercle, the labioscrotal swelling, and the urogenital fold. Both males and females have these during embryonic development. If you have the Y chromosome, if you have the SRY gene, if you have testis determining factor, then one of those structures will become ultimately what is the male structure, the other will become female, right? So this genital tubercle becomes either the glands of the penis or the clitoris in the female. So these are homologous structures. They're not the same structures, but they are derived from the same tissue, right? Derived from that same embryological tissue, right? Same embryonic tissue. Labioscrotal swelling in males becomes the scrotum to house the testes, so the male gonads. In female becomes the labia majora. And then the urogenital fold becomes skin and parts of the tissue along the shaft of the penis and become the labia minora in females, right? And then this is anus, right? More posteriorly located, right? So if you couldn't tell. So you've got this indifferent stage initially, and then it moves in one direction or the other dependent on what chromosomes are present, whether or not that chromosome, the Y chromosome, causes more testosterone to be produced, so these turn into the male structures instead of the female structures. It happens something along those lines, right? Okay. Any questions on any of that? Okay. All right, so last thing we'll do here is look at puberty. Just look at a few changes that occur in males and females, again, at the onset of puberty, largely driven by those sex hormones, so think testosterone, estrogen. Also keep in mind, I think I mentioned this previously, that you find all of these hormones, right? Think testosterone, estrogen, FSH, you find them all in both males and females. You just typically find some more in males and you find some more in females, right? So in genetic males, there happens to be more testosterone, so you get certain developmental processes, you get certain physical characteristics. In females, there's less testosterone, there's more estrogen, so you get another set of changes, processes, secondary sex characteristics, right? So if we look here at the stages of puberty, there's this andronarchy and this gonadarchy. So these are the initial developmental stages resulting in the production of androgens and the production or the maturation of gonads leading to the production of certain sex hormones, right? Along with the gametes. So the oocytes in female and the sperm in male, right? So in the gonads, you're also releasing and producing those sex hormones. Okay? Now, some of these sex hormones, like testosterone, are produced in males and females also in some other location. Do you remember the other location where you produce androgens? We talked about it way back when in endocrine system. The adrenal gland, right? What region of the adrenal gland? The zona reticularis, which is part of the cortex, right? Gold star. So adrenal gland sit on top of the kidney, cortex, zona reticularis. It's also producing some of these, but they're also coming directly from the gonads as well, right? So keep that in mind, right? So with these, depending on whether you have primarily testosterone or primarily estrogen and progesterone, you get certain sex characteristics, right? So in both sexes, you get the development of pubic hair. In females, you have breast enlargement. In male, the increase in testosterone also causes physical changes in the larynx with the vocal cords. And so this is why, on average, males tend to have lower, deeper voices compared to females, right? There are changes with the vocal cords, changes with some of the cartilage as well, right? So again, puberty is also going to kind of start at slightly different times between males and females, usually for females somewhere between ages 10 and 14, and then males are usually a little bit after, right? Usually slightly delayed, okay? So last thing we'll look at here is simply changes in reproductive system as you age, right? So big idea, 30,000 foot view, things slow down, things stop working, right? Just like pretty much all of our other systems, cardiovascular and respiratory and digestive and urinary processes, organs, structures begin to decrease, right? So big thing is the loss of sex hormones, not loss, but decreases in sex hormones. I think testosterone and estrogen. This can also influence like sex drive, sexual desire, right? Things like that. For estrogen also, in females, there's also changes that can occur to other systems. So think like osteoporosis, right? So postmenopausal osteoporosis is somewhat common because of the loss of estrogen, which helps to maintain some of that structural integrity of your skeletal system. So some of the bones become brittle, some of the breast tissue atrophies because of the lack of estrogen. Big thing in males is prostate enlargement as well. Typically, starting somewhere around the age of 40, the prostate begins to hypertrophy, meaning the cells inside the prostate begin to get larger. If you recall from our time in lab, the male urethra runs right through the prostate, right? So if you get enlargement of the prostate, you can affect primarily urination, right? So you can have urinary hesitancy, urinary retention, because the prostate is constricting on the urethra, not allowing it to move through, right? So lots of changes. Most things slow down. They stop working, they break, things like that. Okay.